Coming up, I'll be speaking with Terry Janis, Program Officer with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. That's next on the St. Paul Forum. Welcome to the St. Paul Forum. I'm John Forde. Along with Lisa Tabor, I'll be guest hosting during 2011 while regular host Mike Wassenaar is on sabbatical. With me today is Terry Janis, a program officer with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. Welcome, Terry.
Hey, how you doing?
Very good. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, me too.
You weren't born in St. Paul, were you?
No, I was born in Pine Ridge, South Dakota on the Oglala Sioux tribe.
The story's interesting already. So you grew up there, you lived same house your whole life?
Grew up there, same house my whole life on the Pine Ridge Reservation, graduated from high school there, and then came to McAllister. My first airplane ride was to come and visit McAllister for the first time. It was all very cool.
And you liked St. Paul right away?
No.
Okay. But nonetheless, you bounced back.
No, engaging the academic work at McAllister was really tough. And so it took a couple years for me to finally look around and see St. Paul. But once I did, it's a great town. I really love it.
Okay. And after graduating from McAllister, you have a law degree and another advanced degree?
Yeah, I got a master's in education from Harvard. And I went to law school at the University of Arizona Law School. And I really wanted to combine education and law and engage it from that sort of perspective.
And so you, as I recall, you bounced around like Flagstaff, Helena.
Yeah, I worked on the faculty at the University of Arizona. I was their clinical supervisor for their law school students. Mm-hmm. And then in doing that for about 3 years, I got involved in international human rights work. We represented the Tohono Nation, which historically is both in Mexico and the United States, but the border just cut them in half, right? Uh-huh. So they wanted to engage a lot of those international issues, and we started doing some of that work for them. That's when I connected up with the Indian Law Resource Center in Helena, Montana, and for the next 6 years started doing a lot of international human rights work.
And then you left there, and at that point you came to St. Paul?
Yeah, I came to St. Paul, 8 years ago now. Mm-hmm. I worked with the Northwest Area Foundation for 2 years. And the Northwest Area Foundation was doing some really interesting work at the time. They wanted to take a long-term commitment to communities as a whole. So they found communities to engage issues of poverty and really kind of attack the issue in a direct sort of fashion. And they made long-term commitments to it. And one of the ideas or issues that they addressed was Indian land tenure issues. And so they established a foundation called the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, gave a big $20 million endowment grant to it, and made a 10-year commitment to the foundation. So after 2 years at Northwest Area Foundation doing work on those poverty kind of projects, mm-hmm. I then moved to the Indian Land Tenure Foundation.
What does tenure really mean? I mean, I know it in an academic sense, but land tenure, what does that mean?
Tenure kind of describes the legal nature of land ownership. So if you rent a house, you have tenure in a limited sort of perspective as far as the terms of that rental agreement. Mm-hmm. If you own a piece of property, you own every aspect of that piece of property if it's in fee simple title. That's a type of tenure. Indian nations, it's just a type of title that most people are comfortable with in this mm-hmm. country, right? So with fee simple title, you can lease your land, you can rent it out, you can do a number of different things. So all of those different things that you can do with a piece of land are embodied within that land tenure title ownership. Indian land is owned under a completely separate and distinct kind of land tenure system that's bound up in the history of the relationship between Indian nations and the federal government, and is very complicated, very confusing, and at the end of the day, really doesn't work very well.
Okay, there's more of a social dimension to how Native Americans own land?
There's more of a political and legal dimension to how Native Americans own land. The social dimension is very real and intact within those communities and their perceptions of the land, which is unique and deserves attention. But the tenure issues are really about the law and the politics.
Okay, is this time to bring up Public Law 280, which has to do with, as I understand it, has to do with how the tribes are supposed to deal with the federal government, but somehow the feds just shipped it off to the state and said deal with the states? Is that accurate?
No.
Okay.
No. And actually, it would be better if we get to Public Law 280
Later.
as a part of our conversation about what kind of work the Indian Land Tenure Foundation does.
Okay. So the foundation's been established now for 7 years, and it has like 4 program areas?
It's been around for longer than 7 years, like 9 years.
Okay.
And it's got 4 strategy areas, right? So the kind of strategy is, the overall mission of it is to help Indian nations get their land back, right? The idea is, if Indian nations had more control over their land base, more control over the resources and the jurisdictional authority that comes with that control, then they'd be in a better position to kind of have stability, stronger economies, more stable governments, and the types of resources that people in the community really need in order to grow and engage and create. The reason why establishing greater control for Indian nations over their land base is important is because of the legal history of the United States. In 1887, the United States passed a piece of legislation called the General Allotment Act. And what the Allotment Act did is, of all of the different reservation land that was existent at the time, all of them were established by treaty or some other arrangement with the federal government, right? And it was a significant amount of land. I can't remember the exact acreage, but somewhere around 140 million acres in total. That land base was desired by homesteaders in the United States. There was still a great westward expansion. There was a desire for non-Indians to gain title and access to that land. The General Allotment Act forced or required individual Indians to accept an allotment of land. Historically, that land was held by that nation and those Indian people in common. They used it and made their own decisions about what they were going to do with it, right? Under the Allotment Act, individuals were required to take title to anywhere from 40 acres to 160 acres, right? And that individual ownership completely changed the dynamic of what you identified earlier as the kind of social tenure, the way the community engaged and utilized that land. So with individuals taking individual title to a parcel of land, they then had that ownership interest. And the goal of the Allotment Act was to break up that general common ownership of land and the culture and social community that ties to it, force individuals to take title and ownership of a piece of land, or at least require them, and kind of create the kind of social communities, cultural dynamic that comes from that, that America is more accustomed to, right, with individual title ownership. So you have individual Indians taking ownership of individual parcels of land for the first time ever, right? And what do they do with it? You know, how do they use it? What does it mean, even? And the reality, though, the other reality of it is, it was at the time that our population was at its very lowest, and the wars were completed. All of the killing and kind of death from disease and other things was really at its worst. And so the population base was relatively small. The rest of that land that wasn't allotted to an individual Indian owner was then made available to American homesteaders. Right? So here in Minnesota, right, the White Earth Reservation, even today, 97% of it is owned by non-Indians. And that was the reality in much of Minnesota and the rest of the United States. In total, of all of the reservation land base, 2/3 of it was lost to Indian ownership. 2/3 of it was considered surplus under that system and made available to non-Indian homesteaders. If homesteaders didn't want the land, the state took ownership of it or the federal government took ownership of it.
That sounds pretty close to theft.
It is just a direct taking of resources of Indian people.
My first thought when you said that they forced them to go into individual lots, that it was actually sort of a two-step swindle, that once the Native Americans get this title to land, they don't really understand the value of it in a piece of paper, and you can make a deal.
Exactly. In fact, subsequent legislation came along, and of those individuals that had pieces of property, the federal government established a trust ownership system. You know, like if your parents liked you enough and they wanted to give you their land, and they felt that you were immature, and they created a trust until you gained some level of maturity, right? So that trust would be held for you. The trust owner would take care of it until you reach that level of maturity, and then you would take ownership of it. That trust system, everybody's pretty much used to that.
Yeah.
That kind of trust system was established for these individual Indians. And so that the General Allotment Act held that trust was going to remain in place for 25 years. and then those individuals would take full ownership of it. But what happened was people wanted those pieces of land as well, and so they passed legislation further on that said the federal government could end those trusts and not even tell those Indian owners that they were ending that trust. All of a sudden, that Indian owner gets a letter from the county saying, you didn't pay your taxes, we're selling this, and you can get the proceeds from the sale.